hear voices. As a social scientist, I spend a lot of time listening to the stories that we use to make sense of our lives. And one thing I've learned is that we all have voices in our heads that don't belong to us. I have a voice in my head that I know belongs to my mother. She tells me things. Like nobody expects you to succeed. And you're going to have to work 10 times harder than everyone else because no one's ever going to hand you anything in life. Now I know that my mom told me these stories because she was trying to solve a problem. She was a single mom, raising a son in an unforgiving world. But for a long time, I thought that voice in my head was my own. Somehow, my mother's stories had stuck to my brain and dried on clear, laminating my thinking, and I could no longer tell her voice from mine. Over time, that voice began to influence my behavior and then slowly write the rules for what I believed was possible or not possible for me in the world. You know, for an awful long time, I thought I was driving my life, and it turns out it was actually my mother who was at the wheel. It took a lot of work, a lot of introspection, a lot of therapy for me to recognize that that voice in my head wasn't my own, that it was a story that I had inherited. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. And in that moment, I had the power to reclaim my story and to take back the wheel. And that's the pattern. A story is repeated until it becomes a voice in our heads. That voice becomes more and more powerful and eventually writes rules. And those rules tell us how to behave. Until something forces us to remember that it all started with a story. Now here's the unsettling bit. That pattern, it doesn't just live in our heads. It scales. Because we also have collective stories, great myths and metaphors that have been passed down through the generations that tell us who we are and how the world works. But when those inherited stories dry on clear, then we forget that they're stories at all, and we begin to experience them as reality, as inevitable. So in the same way that a mother's voice can dictate and influence an individual life, our collective stories influence and dictate the systems that we all have to live inside, the systems that touch our everyday lives. Now, there might be no system that touches our everyday lives more than the economy. A lot of people, when they hear economics, think about stocks and bonds and inflation. But let me tell you that the way that we understand the economy has always been based on stories and metaphors. And once those harden, they become the systems and the rules and the policies and the laws that have real winners and losers. In the early 20th century, the story we told ourselves was that the economy was the jungle. This wasn't an accident. See, the Gilded Age had created a world of chaos. As a society, we needed to believe that there was some sort of order underneath the madness. So we reached for Adam Smith's invisible hand. And we borrowed language from Darwin, survival of the fittest, natural equilibrium. And we convinced ourselves that economic markets function just like nature. And therefore, economic outcomes are as natural and inevitable as gravity. When we accepted that story, then the rules followed naturally. You can't regulate a hurricane, so keep your hands off the economy. And you see, that's when the power of the hand became truly invisible. Because if you were a laborer working at a factory for 18 hours a day, making pennies, you were not being oppressed by a corporation. You're being suppressed by your own nature. And when it's natural, well, there's no one to hold accountable. until 1929. See, the Great Depression wasn't just a financial crash. It was the moment when the story we were telling ourselves could no longer describe what we were seeing in the world. When the invisible hand failed to catch us, what had dried on clear became visible again. We stood dazed in the dusty bread lines, and we realized, this isn't a jungle. This is a house that we built, and the roof has collapsed. And once we saw that, we couldn't unsee it. And so we made a new deal. And we told a new story. We went from the jungle to the machine, something we could measure and manage. That solved a problem, namely the need for stability and control. Our language became mechanistic, inputs, outputs, and engines of growth. We built the machine, and then we handed the keys to the machine over to the mechanics, the central bankers. Then the rules changed, but the number one rule was that the machine must be kept running at all costs. Now, the invisible power of the machine is that it doesn't really care about its parts. And eventually, that machine became too big to fail. So in 2008, when the machine began to shake and sputter and smoke, the mechanics rushed in to save the engine, the banks, and everyone else inside the machine was crushed. Millions of people lost their jobs. Millions of families lost their homes because the system was protected, and they were not. For a brief, painful moment, again, what had dried on clear became visible again. Now, there's something critically important to notice in this pattern, and that is, when the invisible becomes visible, either through interrogation or collapse, that we have power to choose a new story. Maybe we'll choose the story that the economy is an ecosystem, naturally emergent and interdependent, able to self-regulate without the need for central control. Oh, that sounds good. It might even solve a problem. I mean, it sounds way more humane than the machine. But we should ask ourselves what might happen if that story dries on clear. Because hummingbirds and flowers don't have lobbyists. Economic actors do. Ecosystems don't change the rules and pick winners and losers, but people sure do, and institutions do. So if we lose sight of that, then the rules that follow will make power invisible and unaccountable. Now, I also know that these systems feel immense and untouchable. But like my pastor used to tell me growing up, if you ever feel too small to make a difference, try sleeping in a tent with a mosquito. The truth is, the stories that we tell have power. Some stories have enough power to determine who gets to thrive and who gets left behind. In 1974, the economic fabric of Bangladesh was in tatters. Millions were in poverty. Many were facing starvation. And the official story was that this kind of poverty, it's inevitable. Some people will always be poor. But there was one economics professor named Muhammad Yunus who decided he couldn't accept that story. So he went into a nearby village to see what was really going on. And what he found there was an economic engine that was being driven by women. They were building small businesses, crafting and weaving, and going to the markets and selling. These were artisans. They were entrepreneurs. And they should have been able to feed their families. But they were trapped in a system built on a story reinforced by the banks, that the poor are not creditworthy, that they can't be trusted with a loan. So Eunice decided to test that story as well. He began to lend the entrepreneur small amounts of money out of his own pocket. And guess what? They paid him back, and they paid him back early. So he decided to start Grameen Bank for them, a financial institution built on a news story, that the poor are not the problem, that they are worthy of credit, worthy of trust, worthy of dignity. One teacher decided to interrogate the official story and wound up unlocking economic opportunity for millions of people. Now, most of us aren't going to go start a bank, but that does not mean that we're powerless, because our systems don't just run on rules. They fundamentally rely on our participation. See, that's why boycotts work. That's why strikes work. Because they remind the system where the story is being held together by us. And when the system loses us, then it begins to break apart. So you don't have to go start a bank. You don't even have to leave a job. But what if we just thought twice about which stories we choose to pass along to our children? We are not powerless. We exercise real power every single day because our systems aren't built on concrete and steel. They're built on stories and rules that we've been given, and they can only survive for as long as we're all willing to play along. And once you see that, well, you'll recognize you're never just a passenger in this thing. You're holding the wheel.